is Kalyani, and she'll be speaking on how affordable are nutritious diets in India. Okay, Kalyani?
Great. Thank you all for attending the talk. The work I'm presenting today is joint work with Derek Heddy and Anna Herforth, who's sitting here in the audience. And it's coming out of the Kandasa project that's led by Will and Derek and generously funded by UK Aid and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So what we're talking about here is the affordability of nutritious diets in India. And Lucas has done a really great job of, motivating my paper, so I don't really need to spend much time doing this. But we know that India accounts for about a third of global stunting and has extremely high rates of both maternal and child underweight and anemia. We heard yesterday in Purnima's talk that many explanations have been proposed for why this might be, but remarkably little focus on diets, especially on nutritious diets and how affordable they are for Indians. So given this gap, what we propose to do in this paper is to use district-level data on food prices and wages to ask two very pertinent questions. The first is, what is the cost of recommended diets, and how has this changed over the course of the data, the period of time for which we have data? The second is, how does the affordability of this recommended diet change over time, but also across gender and across space? So in terms of methods, some of you who attended the Learning Lab a couple of days ago will be familiar with the fact that there are many different ways in which one can measure nutritious diets. So the method that we're using in this paper is called the cost of a recommended diet, or CORD. And what this measure does is it takes country-specific food-based dietary guidelines as given, and then calculates the lowest cost or the minimum cost at which those guidelines can be attained. So the nice thing about these guidelines is that, about this method, is that since it's taking country-specific guidelines into account, it has greater policy relevance and also greater acceptability by government agencies. So India has a food-based dietary guideline, and this dietary guideline specifies both a set of food groups, and then within each of those food groups, a number of portions and the portion size that is recommended. So there are a total of 6 food groups: starchy staples, proteins, dairy, vegetables, fruits, and oils and fats. And there are a couple of things which are interesting about the guidelines that India proposes. Firstly, they specify that at least one dark green leafy vegetable be included in that vegetable category. And secondly, it allows for a completely lacto-vegetarian diet. So you'll notice that the proteins category combines both vegetable proteins as well as animal source proteins. And this is particularly important because about 30% of India's population is vegetarian. So we take this cost of recommended diet, and then in order to assess affordability, we add in information on wages to look at how the cost of this recommended diet has changed relative to the wages that people earn. And what we do in order to calculate this affordability is that we take the wages of unskilled laborers as a good proxy for income of the poor. So this picture, I don't know how many of you can see it, but it's just a snapshot of the recommended guidelines from the NIN manual. And a couple of things are interesting about India's food-based dietary guidelines. The first is that they have a different set of portion sizes or serving sizes, both by gender, so differently for men and women, and then also by activity status. So ranging from sedentary to strenuous, they propose different serving sizes. So what we do is we classify unskilled labor as being moderately strenuous, and so we're looking really at that central red box. That's our area of interest. And you can see that within that central red box, there are differences across genders in serving sizes for 3 categories: cereals, pulses, and oils and fats. So we use these recommendations and these serving sizes to calculate gender-specific costs of recommended diets, which we can then use to look at gender-specific affordabilities. So in terms of data, we're using slightly different data from what Lucas is using in his paper. So we have the National Sample Survey Rural Price and Wage Dataset, and this is collected by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. This data covers a period of approximately 10 years between October 2001 and June 2011, but there's a sort of crucial gap of about 1.5 years in the middle. It covers a total of 24 states and 380 districts. In the price data, we have information on 101 different items or commodities. In the wage data set, we also have rich information on cash and in-kind wages for 18 different occupations. But as I said before, what we're using here is just unskilled labor. We then combine our price and wage data set with other sources of data. Notably, we take state domestic product from the Reserve Bank of India, and we also use the consumer price index for agricultural laborers, which is then used to deflate all our nominal price and wage series. Okay, so I'll go straight into the results, and I'll present them by the two questions that we asked at the beginning. So the first question was, what is the cost of this recommended diet as proposed by India's food-based dietary guidelines? And then how does this cost vary over the time period of our data? So the first thing we do is just look at trends in food prices over time. So what I have here on this graph, okay, I don't know how the pointer works, but along the bottom we have added the time periods of our data ranging from, it's okay, it doesn't matter. Ranging from October 2001, where our data starts, all the way up to June 2011. And what we're plotting on the y-axis is the average price per kilogram, and we've disaggregated it by all the different food groups in our data set. So the main takeaway from this is that nominal prices have increased over the time period of our data. They've increased for almost all food groups, but there are different levels of increase, of course, in different food groups. The other thing that you can see a little bit in this diagram is that there's some fluctuation in prices even within years across months. And an easier way to see this, or a more formalized way to see this, is to actually look at the seasonality in these prices over the course of the months. So what we have added along the bottom are months range from January to December, and you can see that fruit, vegetables, and dark green leafy vegetables exhibit a lot of seasonality. The second thing that we're interested in is just what is the kind of diet that this cost of recommended diet actually predicts. And here we have the most common cheap items that appear in each food group, and you can see the diets that are predicted are actually quite realistic. So the food items that are predicted in each food group are ones that you would expect Indians to be eating. When we look at the changes in this cord or diet over time, so on the right-hand side panel, I have the height of each bar representing the average cost of a recommended diet. And then I've broken up each bar into the contributions to cost of each of the different food groups. So kind of similar to what Lucas presented, we find that dairy is one of the largest contributors to overall cost, and then followed by starchy staples. So one thing to note is that cord has remained actually quite constant over time at approximately 8 rupees. These are all deflated to 1986-87 prices. Okay, the second question was how did the affordability of the recommended diet change over time and also by gender and by space. So this is where we bring in the wage data. So again, we start by looking at trends in wages for men and women over the time period of our data, and these are nominal wages. So you'll note two things. One, that these wages have increased over time, particularly from about 2007 onwards. There's been quite a dramatic uptick. This has been more so in the case for men than for women, but persistently over the entire time period, there's been quite a large wedge between wages for women and wages for men. When we look at real wages, the messages are sort of similar. There's been an increase in real wages over time, particularly from about 2007 onwards, and this increase has been more for men than for women. So the next set of results is kind of obvious from what I presented earlier. We saw that cord has remained more or less constant and that real wages have increased slightly. So what we then, when we put those two things together, the conclusion we come to is that the affordability of these recommended diets has improved slightly over time. So what we have in this diagram is again time along the x-axis and then the ratio of cord to wages. So cord is a percentage of wages along the y-axis. So the line for women is above that for men, which means that the cost of the recommended diet represents a larger proportion of women's wages than it does for men. And the second thing that almost all papers in India find the same result. If one disaggregates this by state, you see there's a large amount of variability across the different states. So the two messages are that affordability of these recommended diets has improved over time, and that there's a great deal of variation that is masked by national averages. So to conclude, we saw that prices are seasonal, that there are certain food groups where the seasonality is more pronounced, and that the seasonality occurs at different points of time in the year. Overall, both prices and wages have risen over time, but the cost of the recommended diet has remained more or less constant, which means that affordability of those diets has improved. However, there are certain caveats. One is that the cost of the recommended diet doesn't take into account non-food expenditure, the fact that family sizes are typically between 4 and 5, or tastes and preferences. And what we saw is that the recommended diet still costs about 50 to 60% of men's wages and 70 to 80% of women's wages. So even though this has improved over time, these diets are still highly unaffordable. So quickly, next steps. I know that I'm out of time. So we're currently working with a second data set, which is a Mandi level or market level data set, which has information on prices on a weekly frequency for a much larger set of commodities. And once we have that data set in place, what we intend to do is to actually look at the relationship between the affordability of diets and actual nutrition outcomes using the last round of the National Family Health Survey from 2015-16. Thank you.